A man stands before a firing squad in 1851, watching his country slide into dictatorship. He could have stayed silent, kept his wealth and status, lived comfortably until a peaceful death. Instead, Victor Hugo chose exile, poverty, and 19 years on a windswept island, where he would write the novels that changed literature forever. This is the story of how a poet became a revolutionary, and how one writer's defiance created books that still shake the world. February 26, 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte rules France with an iron fist, reshaping Europe through conquest and blood. In the garrison town of Besançon, eastern France, a child enters the world during one of history's most turbulent periods. His father, Joseph Leopold Sigisbert Hugo, is a general in Napoleon's army, a man of ambition who will rise to count and governor. His mother, Sophie Trebuchet, comes from the shipbuilding trade in Nantes, a woman of fierce independence and royalist sympathies who despises everything Napoleon represents. The marriage is a catastrophe waiting to happen. They name the boy Victor Marie Hugo. The middle name honours his godfather, but Victor, meaning conqueror, proves prophetic in ways no one could anticipate. His childhood is chaos. Leopold's military career drags the family across Europe. Spain, Italy, back to France, then Spain again. Victor learns to read in Naples, studies in Madrid, watches executions in the street. By age 10, he's seen more of war's brutality than most men witness in a lifetime. His mother and father are locked in a cold war of their own, Sophie's royalist convictions clashing violently with Leopold's Napoleonic loyalty. The tension splits the household down the middle. Sophie eventually separates from Leopold, taking Victor and his brothers to Paris. She settles in a former convent with an overgrown garden, a wild tangle of nature in the heart of the city. For young Victor, that garden becomes everything. A refuge, a kingdom, the first place he feels something like peace. Years later, he'll recreate it in his writing, that sense of green sanctuary amid stone and suffering. The education begins in earnest. Sophie, determined her sons will become royalists like herself, hires tutors. But Victor's real schooling happens in his head. He devours books, Virgil, Homer, Chateaubriand. He starts writing poetry at 14, with a confidence that borders on arrogance. In his notebook, he scrawls a declaration that will become famous. I want to be Chateaubriand or nothing. Not like Chateaubriand, not inspired by him. To be him or cease to exist. At 15, he enters a poetry competition held by the French Academy. The judges assume the submission is from an established writer. When they discover the author's age, they're stunned. Victor doesn't win first prize, but he gets an honourable mention, and suddenly people are paying attention. This isn't a talented child. This is something else entirely. He writes obsessively. Odes, verse dramas, essays. In 1819, at 17, he and his brother Abel found a literary journal, Le Conservateur littéraire. It lasts just over a year, but Victor contributes 22 articles and over 100 pages of poetry. The sheer volume of output is inhuman. He's building something, constructing himself word by word into the writer he's declared he must become. Then he meets Adèle Foucher. She's been a childhood friend, the daughter of a family friend who lived nearby. But when Victor sees her again in his late teens, everything changes. She's beautiful, intelligent, and her parents think Victor is a penniless poet with no prospects. They forbid the relationship. Victor responds the only way he knows how. He writes love letters, poems, a novel. He publishes his first book of poetry, Odes et Poésies diverses, in 1822. It's successful enough that King Louis XVIII, recently restored to the throne after Napoleon's fall, grants Victor an annual pension of 1,000 francs. Suddenly he has income, he has status, he's 20 years old. Adèle's parents relent. The wedding happens in October 1822, the same year Victor's mother dies. Sophie never sees her son married, never knows he'll name his first daughter after his wife. The loss cuts deep, but Victor has learned to transmute grief into art. It's a skill he'll need repeatedly. The marriage starts with genuine love. Adele and Victor are happy, sharing a cramped apartment in Paris, living on poetry and passion. She becomes pregnant almost immediately. Their first child, Leopold, is born in July 1823, but dies in infancy. The second, Leopoldine, arrives in 1824 and survives. Then Charles in 1826, François Victor in 1828, and Adele in 1830. 5 children in 8 years, while Victor writes at a pace that seems impossible. Because he's not just writing poetry anymore, he's becoming the leader of a movement that will tear French literature apart. Romanticism is sweeping across Europe, a revolt against the rigid rules of classical art. In England, Byron and Shelley are writing. In Germany, Goethe's Faust is reshaping what literature can be. But France remains locked in classicism, its theatre governed by unities of time and place, its poetry constrained by ancient Greek models. The French Academy guards these rules like sacred law. Victor Hugo decides the law must be broken. In 1827, he publishes a play called Cromwell with a preface that becomes a manifesto. He argues that modern drama should mix comedy and tragedy, the grotesque and the sublime, just as real life does. Shakespeare, not Racine, should be the model. The rules are prisons, and art must be free. The Academy is scandalized. Critics call him a barbarian, but young writers rally to his banner. A circle forms around Hugo, meeting at his apartment to argue, debate, and plan the revolution. They call themselves the Cénacle, a brotherhood of artists determined to destroy the old world and build something new. The battle comes to a head on February 25th, 1830. Hugo's play Hernani premieres at the Comédie Française, the temple of French classical theatre. He's written a romantic drama that violates every rule the establishment holds sacred. The opening night becomes a war. Hugo's supporters pack the theatre. They arrive hours early, dressed flamboyantly, ready to defend the play with shouts and fists if necessary. Théophile Gautier wears a red vest that becomes legendary. When the curtain rises and the first lines break traditional metre, the classicists in the audience begin hissing. Hugo's supporters roar back approval. Every scene becomes a battlefield, applause and jeers crashing against each other like armies. The play runs for 45 performances. Some nights end in near riots, but Hernani survives, and with it, French Romanticism wins its war. Victor Hugo, at 28, has become the most famous writer in France. Fame brings money, which brings a new house. Hugo moves his growing family to Place Royale, now Place des Vosges, one of Paris's most beautiful squares. The apartment is enormous, and Hugo transforms it into a salon where artists, politicians, and intellectuals gather. He's at the centre of French cultural life, writing poetry that sells thousands of copies, plays that fill theatres, novels that captivate the public. But success creates its own problems. The pressure to produce never stops. Publishers want more books, theatres demand more plays, his family needs more money. And Adele, buried under childcare and household management, begins to feel like a stranger in her own life. Their marriage starts to crack. The passion fades into routine into resentment. Adele feels neglected, invisible. Victor is consumed by his work, his fame, his mission. He loves his wife, but he's married to his writing. In 1831, Hugo publishes Notre-Dame de Paris, known in English as The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. He's been contracted to deliver a historical novel, and he's months past deadline. The publisher threatens legal action. Hugo locks himself in his study, buys a bottle of ink and a grey knitted shawl that covers everything but his face, and refuses to leave until the book is finished. He completes it in 6 months. The novel is a phenomenon. It tells the story of Quasimodo, the deformed bell ringer of Notre-Dame Cathedral, his love for the beautiful Esmeralda, and the corruption of Claude Frollo, the archdeacon consumed by obsession. But underneath the Gothic drama, Hugo has embedded something deeper, a meditation on architecture, history, and the soul of Paris itself. He describes the cathedral in such loving detail that readers fall in love with the building. He argues that Gothic architecture is a form of writing, that before printing presses, humanity wrote its thoughts in stone. The book makes Notre Dame famous. Tourists flood the cathedral. The French government, which has been allowing the medieval structure to decay, suddenly realizes it's a national treasure worth preserving. A restoration begins that will last decades. Victor Hugo has saved a building through the power of fiction. But at home, the walls are closing in. Adele grows distant. The children sense the tension. And Victor, desperate for connection, makes a choice that will haunt him. In 1833, at a dinner party, he meets an actress named Juliette Drouet. She's beautiful, talented, and buried in debt from a series of disastrous relationships. She's also playing a small role in Hugo's new play. They begin an affair that will last 50 years until her death. Hugo doesn't hide it well. Paris knows. Adele knows. But this is the 19th century, and men of Hugo's class are expected to have mistresses. What's unusual is that Hugo falls genuinely in love. Juliette becomes his muse, his secretary, his companion. She copies his manuscripts, manages his correspondence, and saves every letter he writes her. Thousands of them, a complete record of their relationship. Adele, devastated, begins her own affair with one of Hugo's closest friends, the critic Sainte-Beuve. The betrayal cuts Victor deeply, but he has no moral ground to stand on. The marriage becomes a shell, maintained for appearances and the children's sake. They stay together but live separate lives under the same roof. Through all this chaos, Hugo keeps writing. Plays, poems, novels. In 1838, he publishes Ruy Blas, another theatrical triumph. He's elected to the French Academy in 1841 after multiple rejections, finally receiving the official recognition he's craved. He's made a peer of France by King Louis Philippe in 1845, entering politics for the first time. Everything seems perfect. Fame, wealth, political power, a mistress who adores him, a wife who manages his household, 5 healthy children. Victor Hugo has conquered Paris. Then September 4th, 1843 arrives, and his world collapses. His daughter Leopoldine, 19 years old and recently married, drowns in the Seine. She's boating with her husband Charles when their vessel capsizes. Charles tries to save her, but her heavy skirts drag her under. He dives after her again and again until he drowns too. Both bodies are recovered the next day. Victor is travelling when it happens. He learns about his daughter's death by reading a newspaper in a cafe. The article is matter-of-fact, listing the victims' names. He reads his daughter's name among the dead. The grief destroys him. For years he can barely write. The man who produced thousands of pages annually falls silent. He fills notebooks with fragments, attempts at poems that go nowhere, sketches of his daughter's face. On every anniversary of her death, he writes a poem. They're raw, brutal in their honesty, a father's howl at an indifferent universe. But the silence can't last forever. In 1848, revolution erupts across Europe. In France, King Louis Philippe abdicates. The Second Republic is declared. And Victor Hugo, emerging from his grief, steps onto a stage far more dangerous than any theatre. The barricades go up in February 1848, and this time, Hugo doesn't watch from a window. He's in the streets, witnessing the monarchy collapse in 3 days of chaos. Workers, students, and bourgeois liberals unite against Louis Philippe's increasingly corrupt regime. The king flees to England, disguised as Mr. Smith. France becomes a republic again. Hugo throws himself into politics with the same intensity he once reserved for poetry. He's elected to the National Assembly representing Paris. His speeches are magnificent, theatrical performances that pack the chamber. He argues for free education, universal suffrage, the abolition of poverty itself. He believes the Republic can be perfected through reason and goodwill. But the Second Republic is born into crisis. The economy is collapsing. Unemployment is rampant. The government closes the national workshops that provided jobs for thousands of workers. In June, Paris explodes again. This time, it's not a unified revolution, but a class war. Workers build barricades in the eastern neighborhoods. The assembly sends in the army. Hugo walks through the carnage, bodies in the streets, summary executions, thousands arrested and deported to Algeria without trial. The brutality shocks him. This isn't the glorious revolution he imagined. It's slaughter, and the republic he supports is doing the killing. His faith in gradual reform begins to crack. Then comes Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great emperor. He spent his life trading on his uncle's name, launching pathetic coup attempts and writing pamphlets from exile. Most people consider him a joke. Hugo certainly does. He calls him Napoleon the Little in private conversations, mocking his pretensions. But Louis Napoleon understands something Hugo doesn't. Sentiment matters more than policy. He campaigns on nostalgia for imperial glory, on promises to restore French greatness. He wins the presidential election in December 1848 by a landslide. Hugo is stunned. How could France choose this mediocrity? For 3 years, Hugo watches Louis Napoleon consolidate power. The president appoints loyalists, purges opponents, builds support in the army. Hugo speaks against him in the assembly, warning that this man means to make himself dictator. Few listen. Most deputies think Hugo is being theatrical again, seeing drama where there's only politics. December 2nd, 1851, the anniversary of Napoleon Bonaparte's coronation as emperor and his great victory at Austerlitz. Louis Napoleon launches his coup. Troops occupy Paris. The assembly is dissolved. Opposition leaders are arrested in their homes before dawn. Hugo isn't arrested. He's famous enough that taking him might spark resistance. He spends the day racing between meeting points, trying to organise opposition. A handful of Republican deputies gather to draft proclamations declaring Louis Napoleon a traitor. They print leaflets calling for resistance. Hugo himself goes to the barricades that spring up in working-class neighbourhoods. But there's no real uprising. The workers remember June 1848 when the Republic massacred them. Why die for deputies who sent in the army 3 years ago? The barricades are small, poorly defended. The army crushes them in 2 days. Hugo watches soldiers shoot an unarmed protester in the street. The man's last words, "Long live the Republic." The next day, Hugo's friends tell him he's on the arrest list. Leave now or face prison, possibly execution. Juliet has already fled, disguised as a worker's wife. Hugo's sons are in hiding. He has hours at most. On December 11th, 1851, using a false passport under the name Lanvin, Victor Hugo crosses the border into Belgium. He's 50 years old. He believes he'll return in weeks, maybe months, once Louis Napoleon's coup collapses. He'll be in exile for 19 years. Brussels receives him as a hero. Other French exiles gather around him. They write manifestos, plan resistance, convince themselves the French people will rise up any day now. They don't. In January 1852, Louis Napoleon stages a plebiscite, asking France to approve his seizure of power. Nearly 8 million vote yes, 600,000 vote no. France wants order, stability, glory. It doesn't want Hugo's republic. The Belgian government, nervous about antagonising France, asks Hugo to please stop making incendiary speeches. He refuses. In 1852, Belgium expels him. He moves to Jersey, a British island in the Channel. Then Jersey expels him for attacking Queen Victoria's friendship with Napoleon III, as Louis Napoleon now calls himself after declaring the Second Empire. In 1855, Hugo moves to Guernsey, a smaller, more remote island where the British authorities leave him alone. Guernsey becomes his fortress. He buys Hauteville House with royalties from his books, still selling well despite his exile. He transforms the building into a Gothic fantasy, designing every room himself. Dark wood, carved furniture, medieval tapestries. His study is a glass box on the roof, where he writes standing at a desk, looking out at the sea and France beyond. The exile changes him. The man who loves salons and theatres now lives in isolation. His family joins him, but the house is tense. Adele still hasn't forgiven him. His sons are restless, bitter about their exile. His daughter Adele, named for her mother, is descending into mental illness that will eventually require institutionalization. Hugo establishes a routine rigid as clockwork. Wake at dawn, cold bath even in winter, write standing up until lunch, afternoon walk, always the same route, evening with family, reading aloud from whatever he's working on. He invites refugees to dinner every week, feeding dozens of exiles who've washed up on Guernsey with nothing. He becomes obsessed with spiritualism, attending seances where mediums claim to channel the dead. He believes he's spoken with his daughter Leopoldine, with Shakespeare, with Jesus Christ. His notebooks fill with transcripts of these conversations, strange and beautiful, and possibly mad. And he writes, not plays anymore. Those require theatres, audiences, actors. He writes what one man alone can create, poetry and novels. In 1853, he publishes a slim volume called Châtiments, Punishments. It's a sustained assault on Napoleon III, 400 pages of satirical verse calling the emperor a tyrant, a murderer, a clown. The book is banned in France, which only makes it more popular. Copies are smuggled across the border, passed hand to hand, read in secret. Then in 1856, he publishes Les Contemplations, Contemplations. It's his masterpiece in poetry. 2 volumes tracing his entire life through verse. The first volume covers the years before Leopoldine's death. The second, everything after. The poem marking the division is dated September 4th, 1843, the day she drowned. The collection becomes one of the best-selling poetry books in French history. But Hugo isn't satisfied with poetry. He wants to write the novel he's been planning for decades, the massive social epic about crime and redemption and the poor of Paris. He's been taking notes since the 1820s, sketching characters, collecting research about convict prisons and sewers, and street slang. In exile, finally, he has time. He starts writing in 1860. For 2 years he works obsessively, producing pages every morning in his rooftop study. The novel grows to enormous length, 5 volumes, 1,500 pages. He calls it Les Misérables, the Wretched. The story follows Jean Valjean, a man imprisoned for 19 years for stealing bread to feed his sister's starving children. Released on parole, he's rejected by society until a bishop shows him mercy. Valjean reinvents himself, becomes a factory owner and mayor, but his past pursues him in the form of Inspector Java, a policeman who believes the law is absolute and criminals can never change. Woven through Valjean's story is an entire world. Fantine, the factory worker who becomes a prostitute to support her daughter. Cosette, that daughter, rescued by Valjean and raised as his own. Marius, the young revolutionary who falls in love with Cosette. The Thénardier, the criminal couple who exploit everyone they meet. And the June Rebellion of 1832, when students and workers built barricades and died for a republic that wouldn't come for 16 more years. Hugo interrupts the plot constantly for essays. 50 pages on the Battle of Waterloo, 80 pages on the Paris sewers, entire chapters on argot, the secret language of criminals. He explains monastic orders, discusses the nature of revolutions, meditates on the meaning of poverty. Modern readers often skip these sections, impatient to return to the story. But for Hugo, they are the story. He's not just writing a novel. He's writing an encyclopedia of suffering and an argument for redemption. The central question, can people change? Javert says no. The law is fixed. A criminal is always a criminal. Hugo, through Valjean, argues yes, people are shaped by society. Treat them with cruelty and they become cruel. Show them mercy and they can become something else. It's a radical idea in 1862, when prisons are brutal and punishment is considered justice. Hugo sells the publishing rights for an unprecedented sum. The publisher pays 300,000 francs, the largest advance in literary history to that point. The book is released simultaneously in Paris, Brussels, Leipzig, London, Rotterdam, Warsaw, Budapest, Madrid, and Rio de Janeiro. It's a global event. The reviews are savage. Critics call it excessive, melodramatic, preachy. Flaubert, the master of restrained realism, says it's written for the Catholic socialist shithouse. The literary establishment hates its sentimentality, its digressions, its obvious moral lessons. The public doesn't care. Les Misérables becomes an instant bestseller across Europe. Workers buy it in installments they can barely afford. Prisoners beg guards to read it to them. In Italy, dock workers supposedly pool their money to buy a single copy, gathering each evening to hear the next chapter read aloud. The book is banned in Russia, but circulated anyway. Napoleon III, the target of so much of Hugo's exile rhetoric, keeps a copy by his bedside. Why does it connect so powerfully? Because Hugo takes the people society considers worthless and makes them central. The prostitute, the convict, the street urchin, the old revolutionary no one remembers. He shows their suffering in excruciating detail and insists it matters. He argues that a society is judged not by how it treats its best citizens, but its worst. The book makes Hugo wealthy beyond imagination. He's already famous, but Les Misérables transforms him into something else. A moral voice, a conscience in exile, the old man on his island who speaks for the poor. Napoleon III's government tries to ignore him. Occasionally they offer amnesty to exiles, allowing them to return if they swear loyalty to the empire. Hugo always refuses. He'll return to France only when France returns to republican government. Each refusal is public, theatrical, a slap at imperial legitimacy. The years pass slowly on Guernsey. Hugo ages but doesn't soften. His hair goes white. His face becomes the craggy mask we recognise from photographs. He continues his routine, writing, walking, feeding refugees, attending séances. Juliet lives in a house nearby, still his companion after 30 years. Adele, his wife, maintains the household with cold efficiency. They're still married, but haven't shared a bed in decades. In 1868, his wife, Adele, dies in Brussels while visiting relatives. Hugo attends the funeral, but shows little emotion in public. In private, he writes in his journal that he's lost a sister, not a wife. Whatever they once had died long ago. Then 1870 arrives and history finally turns. Napoleon III, trying to maintain prestige, lets himself be provoked into war with Prussia. The French army is crushed. The emperor is captured at Sedan. Paris declares the Third Republic on September 4th, 1870, 37 years to the day after Léopoldine drowned. The very next day, Victor Hugo boards a train in Brussels. He's been in exile for 19 years. He's 68 years old. He's returning to Paris as the Germans march on the city. Thousands gather at the station to meet him. They unhitch the horses from his carriage and pull it themselves through the streets. People hang from windows, shouting his name. He's no longer just a writer. He's a symbol of resistance, of republican faith, of the France that refused to bow. Hugo stands in his carriage, tears streaming down his face, looking at the city he's dreamed about for 2 decades. Paris is starving. The Germans have surrounded the city. 4 months into the siege, rats sell for premium prices. The zoo animals have been eaten. Elephants from the Jardin des Plantes end up on restaurant menus as exotic meat. People boil leather shoes for broth. Hugo, who returned expecting triumph, finds himself trapped in a city slowly dying. He rents an apartment on the Rue de Clichy and immediately begins working. Not writing poetry or novels, writing propaganda. The government of national defense needs morale boosted, and Hugo throws himself into the task. He publishes manifestos calling for resistance. He speaks at public meetings, his voice still powerful despite his age. When the government proposes surrender, he argues against it with fury that shocks even his supporters. But he also does something more practical. He opens a soup kitchen. Every day, using his own money, he feeds hundreds of Parisians. The lines stretch around the block. Mothers bring children with distended bellies. Old men who fought in Napoleon's armies shuffle forward with empty bowls. Hugo serves them himself, ladling thin soup, refusing to let servants do what he considers his duty. The city holds out through winter. January 1871 brings capitulation. The Germans march through Paris in a victory parade. Hugo watches from his window, weeping with rage. He's lived long enough to see France defeated twice, once by herself and once by Prussia. The humiliation is total. Then something unexpected happens. The Paris Commune rises. The working people of Paris, furious at the government for surrendering, furious at being besieged and starved while the rich fled to safety, seize control of the city. They establish a revolutionary government. They declare Paris autonomous, socialist, free. The national government, now relocated to Versailles, prepares to crush them. Hugo's position becomes impossible. He supports Republican government. He hates monarchists and reactionaries, but he also fears mob violence and revolutionary excess. The Commune executes hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris. Buildings burn. Barricades go up in the streets exactly like 1848, exactly like 1832. He tries to mediate. He publishes appeals for reconciliation. No one listens. The Versailles government attacks Paris with its army. The Commune fights back. For 1 week in May 1871, Paris becomes a battlefield. Thousands die in street fighting. Government troops execute communards against walls, shooting them in batches. The communards, in their final hours, burn public buildings. The Tuileries Palace goes up in flames. So does the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. Hugo watches his city tear itself apart and realizes something terrible. Les Misérables didn't prevent this. His decades of writing about justice and mercy changed nothing. The barricades he described with such romantic fervour in his novel became real again, and real people died on them, and the government slaughtered them anyway. 20,000 Parisians are killed in the suppression of the Commune. Thousands more are deported to penal colonies. Hugo, despite his reservations about the Commune's methods, speaks out immediately for amnesty. He argues that France cannot heal through revenge. He demands pardons for the communards, return of the exiles, clemency instead of blood. The government ignores him. Worse, the public turns hostile. Parisians, traumatized and exhausted, want order. They see Hugo's calls for amnesty as sympathy for murderers and arsonists. His popularity, so overwhelming when he returned, evaporates almost overnight. In July 1871, he's elected to the National Assembly. He travels to Bordeaux, where the Assembly's meeting temporarily. He gives one speech calling for amnesty and reconciliation. The right-wing deputies shout him down. They call him a communist, a traitor, an old fool. He walks out of the chamber and resigns his seat the next day. He's done with electoral politics. At 69 years old, he's fought for Republican government for half a century and watched it fail repeatedly. Democracy keeps giving way to empire or chaos or both. The people he championed keep either ignoring him or attacking him. He returns to his writing, but now there's another tragedy to bear. His son Charles dies suddenly in March 1871 at age 44. A stroke. Hugo is devastated. Charles was his eldest surviving son, the one who seemed stable and capable. Now only François Victor remains, and François Victor's health is failing. Hugo buries Charles in the Père Lachaise cemetery, the same cemetery where communards were executed against the walls just months earlier. The grief is overwhelming, made worse because his daughter Adele is still alive but insane, locked in an asylum, unable to recognize her own father. His family has been systematically destroyed. He moves to a house on the Rue Pigalle and continues working. The work becomes his only anchor. He publishes a book about the Commune called L'année terrible, the terrible year. It's poetry about the siege, the war, the revolution, the deaths. Critics dismiss it as too political, too angry, too unpolished. Hugo doesn't care. He's writing for himself now, processing grief the only way he knows how. François Victor dies in December 1873. Another stroke. Hugo has now outlived his wife, 3 of his 4 children, and most of his generation. He's 71 years old. He attends yet another funeral, stands at yet another grave, and goes home to his empty house. He keeps writing. What else can he do? In 1874, he publishes a novel called 93, set during the French Revolution, about the terror and the civil war in the Vendée. It's a meditation on violence and mercy, revolution and humanity. The central question it asks, over and over, is whether political goals justify murder. Hugo's answer, hardened by watching the Commune's suppression, is no, never. No cause is worth killing for, because the moment you kill, you become what you're fighting against. The book sells well, but doesn't achieve the cultural impact of Les Misérables. Times have changed. Readers want escape, not moral lectures about revolutions. Hugo is becoming a relic, a survivor from another era whose certainties seem increasingly out of place. But something strange begins happening in the late 1870s. As he ages, as his body weakens, as he becomes visibly mortal, public affection returns. People start to see him not as a political figure, but as a monument, a living connection to France's history. He knew Napoleon. He lived through every revolution. He embodies the entire turbulent century. On his 79th birthday in 1881, Paris throws him a celebration unlike anything France has ever seen for a living person. 600,000 people march past his house on the Avenue d'Eylau. 600,000. The parade lasts for 6 hours. Workers, students, soldiers, government officials, artists, ordinary families with children. They file past his window while he stands on his balcony, weeping, waving, overwhelmed. The government renames the street. It becomes Avenue Victor Hugo. He's still alive, and they're naming streets after him. He jokes that he'll have to pay rent to himself. He's become what he always wanted to be. The voice of France, the conscience of the Republic, the old man who speaks for the poor and remembers every injustice. But he's also become something he never anticipated, a celebrity in the modern sense, someone famous for being famous, whose actual work matters less than his symbolic presence. He continues his routine. Up early, writing until noon. At lunch, a walk, more writing. Dinner with whatever guests appear. He still feeds the poor every week. He still attends spiritualist seances, still believes he's communicating with Leopoldine. He still takes young mistresses, his sexual appetite undimmed even in his 80s. Juliette Drouet, now elderly herself, still lives nearby, still receives him regularly, still maintains the fiction that she's his only love. In 1883, Juliette dies. She's 77. They've been together for 50 years. Hugo is 81 and loses the one person who loved him without reservation or complication. He writes in his journal that he's lost his wing. He attends her funeral. barely able to stand, supported by friends. He's the last one left. Everyone from his youth is dead. Everyone from his middle age is dead. Most people from his old age are dead. He's outlived his generation, his children, his lovers, his enemies, his friends. He walks through Paris and sees buildings he remembers being built, streets he remembers being cobbled, monuments he remembers being dedicated. He's a ghost in his own city. His health deteriorates rapidly after Juliet's death. He catches pneumonia in early 1885. He recovers partially, but remains weak. His mind stays sharp, but his body is failing. He knows it. Everyone knows it. On May 15th, 1885, he suffers a stroke. He's bedridden, struggling to breathe. Doctors are summoned. The government sends officials to check on him. Newspapers print daily updates on his condition. The entire country holds its breath. For a week he lingers, sometimes conscious, sometimes not. His grandchildren sit by his bed. Friends visit. Priests offer last rites, which he refuses. He's never returned to the church despite decades of pressure. He believes in God, he insists, but not in priests or dogma or organized religion. On May 22nd, 1885, at 1:27 in the afternoon, Victor Hugo dies. He's 83 years old. He's been famous for 65 years. He's published across 7 decades. He's outlived 4 governments and witnessed 2 revolutions and 3 wars. He's written 50 volumes of work, from poetry to novels to plays to political manifestos. The news spreads instantly. Paris shuts down. Theatres close. Newspapers print special editions with black borders. The government immediately declares a state funeral, something normally reserved for heads of state and military heroes. Hugo will receive the highest honour France can bestow. His will specifies he wants a pauper's funeral. He wants to be buried in a simple coffin, transported in a hearse for the poor. The government decides to honour this literally, but turn it into spectacle. They commission a massive pauper's hearse, ornate and enormous, pulled by 16 black horses. The coffin will be simple as he requested, but the ceremony will be anything but. The body lies in state under the Arc de Triomphe, draped in black crepe. For 2 days and 2 nights, people file past. Estimates suggest 2 million people come to pay respects. Some wait 10 hours in line. They come from across France and beyond. Workers in their rough clothes stand next to government ministers in formal dress. Everyone equal before the coffin of the man who insisted they were equal in dignity. The funeral procession on June 1st, 1885, becomes the largest in French history. Every segment of society participates. Workers' unions march with their banners. Student groups carry wreaths. Military bands play dirges. The procession stretches for miles, taking 6 hours to move from the Arc de Triomphe to the Panthéon, where Hugo will be buried among France's greatest figures. Anarchists throw flowers. Socialists sing the Marseillaise. Republicans weep openly. Even monarchists attend, recognizing that whatever their disagreements, Hugo mattered. He meant something. His death marks the end of an era in a way that feels tangible, undeniable. They place his coffin in the Panthéon's crypt next to Voltaire and Rousseau, the 3 great voices of France's conscience lined up in death as they were in spirit. The inscription is simple: Victor Hugo. No titles, no honours, just the name. It's enough. Everyone knows who he was and what he represented. The orphan who became a viscount, the royalist who became a republican, the wealthy man who fed the poor, the exile who refused to compromise, the father who lost everything, the writer who never stopped working. The death of Hugo unleashed something unexpected across Europe. Writers who'd spent decades dismissed as radicals or romantics suddenly found themselves being read differently. His funeral wasn't just mourning one man, it was recognizing that literature could be a form of power equal to any government or army. Within weeks, publishers across France reported surging sales of Hugo's complete works. But more surprising was what happened beyond France's borders. In Russia, Dostoevsky had died 4 years earlier, but his work was experiencing a renaissance partly inspired by Hugo's example. Tolstoy, still alive and writing, publicly declared Hugo one of the few writers who understood that art must serve humanity's moral progress. In England, Thomas Hardy attended a memorial service in London and later wrote that Hugo proved a novelist could be a philosopher without sacrificing story. Even in America, where Hugo had never visited, newspapers devoted front pages to his death. Mark Twain published a tribute calling him the conscience of the 19th century. This wasn't celebrity mourning. Something deeper was happening. The idea that a writer could matter this much, could shape how millions of people understood justice and compassion and human dignity, was being validated on a scale never seen before. The novel as a form was being elevated from entertainment to essential cultural force. Within the pantheon itself, Hugo's presence changed the building's meaning. It had been built as a church secularized during the Revolution, turned back into a church under Napoleon, secularized again under the Republic. His burial there felt permanent in a way previous interments hadn't. The crypt became a pilgrimage site. People visited not to pray, but to pay respects to ideas, liberty, equality, the power of words to change the world. But Hugo's real legacy wasn't in marble crypts or state ceremonies. It was in what happened next in literature itself. The generation of writers who came after Hugo had grown up reading his work. They'd absorbed his techniques, his ambitions, his belief that novels could do more than tell stories. They could diagnose society's failures and imagine alternatives. Look at what emerged in the decades following his death. Émile Zola launched naturalism, applying scientific observation to fiction, documenting how poverty and environment shaped human lives. His 20-novel Rougon-Macquart cycle was consciously modelled on Hugo's ambition to capture an entire society in fiction. Anatole France won the Nobel Prize writing novels that combined Hugo's social conscience with sharper irony. Romain Rolland created Jean Christophe, a 10-volume novel tracking one man's life across decades, echoing Les Misérables' scope. Even writers who rejected Hugo's Romanticism couldn't escape his shadow. The symbolists who wanted pure poetry, art divorced from politics, were reacting against Hugo. But reaction is still influence. You can't define yourself against something irrelevant. The global spread was even more striking. In Latin America, Hugo became a secular saint. Simón Bolívar had met him during the Wars of Independence, and Hugo had written passionately, supporting Latin American liberation. A century later, writers from Buenos Aires to Mexico City claimed him as inspiration. Gabriel Garcia Marquez later said that reading Hugo as a teenager showed him that novels could contain everything: love, politics, history, philosophy, adventure, all woven together without apology. In Asia, Hugo arrived through translation and created literary earthquakes. Japanese intellectuals discovering Les Misérables in the 1880s found a model for how to critique their own society's rapid modernization and treatment of the poor. Chinese reformers used Hugo's arguments about justice and human rights to challenge imperial authority. Victor Hugo's societies formed in cities across Asia, reading groups that were half literary appreciation and half political organizing. The musical adaptation of Les Misérables in 1980, a century after Hugo's death, proved the work's immortality. It became the longest-running musical in history, seen by over 130 million people in 44 countries. The songs were translated into 22 languages. Revolutionary students in Tiananmen Square in 1989 sang "Do You Hear the People Sing" as an anthem. The same song was sung during the Arab Spring in 2011, during Hong Kong protests in 2014, during resistance movements across the world. This is what Hugo had wanted. Not statues or academic analysis, but living connection with ordinary people facing injustice. His influence on later revolutionary movements is impossible to quantify, but undeniable. Lenin had read Hugo, so had Gandhi. Martin Luther King Jr. cited Les Misérables as formative in developing his understanding of civil disobedience and redemption. The book appeared on reading lists for everyone from anarchists to Christian reformers, each finding different ammunition for their causes in its pages. But the literary techniques mattered as much as the politics. Hugo pioneered things we now take for granted. The idea that a novel could pause its plot for chapters of historical analysis or philosophical digression. The use of parallel storylines that converge dramatically. The creation of characters who embody ideas without becoming mere symbols. The mixing of high tragedy and low comedy, sometimes in the same scene. Modern fantasy literature owes him an enormous debt rarely acknowledged. Tolkien's hobbits living in the Shire, comfortable and provincial, then thrust into epic struggles between good and evil. That's the structure Hugo used. The orphan discovering hidden nobility, the fallen man seeking redemption, the small act of mercy that changes everything. These became fantasy tropes because Hugo made them work in realistic settings first. Crime fiction, similarly, carries his DNA. The detective who's more interested in understanding criminals than punishing them, the investigation that reveals social injustice, the twist where the pursued becomes sympathetic and the pursuer questionable. All of this runs through Hugo to Javert and Valjean into 1,000 police procedurals and legal thrillers. Even the concept of the blockbuster, the book everyone must read, the cultural event that transcends literature to become shared experience, Hugo established that. Before Les Misérables, books sold well or poorly. After it, publishers chased the mega hit, the book that would dominate conversation for months. We live in the world Hugo created, where a novel's success is measured not just in copies sold, but in cultural penetration. His failures are instructive too. The tendencies that made critics roll their eyes, the melodrama, the speeches, the coincidences, these became warnings for later writers. Show, don't tell. Trust your reader. Less is more. These mantras of modern writing workshops are partly reactions against Hugo's excesses. He taught by negative example what not to do, which is still teaching. The personal life, messy and complicated, also became template. The great writer with conventional public image and unconventional private reality. The family tragedies transforming into art. The exile using distance to see his country more clearly. The older artist refusing to rest on past achievements, always starting new projects, risking failure. This model of the writer's life, ambitious and tragic and productive until the end, that's Hugo's pattern repeated in 1,000 biographies since. His relationship with Juliette Drouet, 50 years of devotion despite never marrying, created a romantic template copied and analysed endlessly. The muse who's also partner, collaborator, first reader, protector. Their correspondence, thousands of letters, became a study in how creative partnerships function. She edited his work, managed his household during exile, copied manuscripts, offered criticism he'd accept from no one else. When she died 2 years before him, something broke in Hugo that never repaired. His final works have a darkness absent earlier, an acknowledgement that redemption has limits, that some losses can't be transformed into art or politics or meaning. The Hunchback of Notre-Dame ended with Quasimodo dying on Esmeralda's grave, their skeletons intertwined. Hugo's last poems circle back to that image obsessively. Love and death intertwined, inseparable, the final truth after all the politics and philosophy. His relationship with his children's deaths never resolved. He wrote their names in his diary every day for 40 years after Leopoldine drowned. Every single day. The grief didn't fade or transform into acceptance. It remained, a wound he wouldn't let heal, because healing felt like forgetting. This refusal to move on, to find closure, is very modern. We understand now that some griefs don't resolve, they just become part of who you are. The posthumous publication of his final works revealed dimensions admirers hadn't suspected. Poems written in his 80s, exploring doubt, questioning God, confronting mortality without easy answers. A play left unfinished deliberately, as if completion would be dishonest. Notes for novels he'd never write. Ideas that would have taken him into psychological territory he'd avoided earlier. An old man still restless, still unsatisfied, still believing the next work might finally say what needed saying. His instructions for his literary estate were characteristically generous and controlling. Everything was to be published eventually, but slowly, parcelled out over decades. He wanted to remain present in French culture long after death, a steady stream of new Hugo works appearing like messages from beyond. It worked. Publishers released his complete works in waves through the early 20th century, each volume an event. The house on Place des Vosges where he'd lived became a museum within a year of his death. People walked through rooms where Les Misérables was written, seeing furniture he'd designed, reading letters framed on walls. It's still there, still visited, a shrine to the writer as secular saint. His house in Guernsey similarly became pilgrimage site, the exile's fortress now tourist destination. But the real museums were libraries. Every major library in France acquired complete Hugo collections. Schools made his work mandatory reading. The Third Republic, establishing universal public education in the 1880s, put Hugo at the centre of the curriculum. French children learned to read using his poems. They studied Les Misérables in grammar school, Notre-Dame in secondary school. He became France's national pedagogy. This canonization had costs. The radical edge got sanded down in classroom versions. Teachers emphasized patriotism and moral uplift while skipping the attacks on capitalism and organized religion. Hugo, the safe classic, replaced Hugo, the dangerous revolutionary. By the 1920s, avant-garde writers were rejecting him as establishment, old-fashioned, the past they needed to destroy to create something new. The surrealists, particularly, despised him. They saw his work as everything wrong with 19th century literature. Too earnest, too moral, too invested in rational progress and social reform. They wanted dream logic, unconscious eruption, destruction of meaning itself. Hugo represented the enemy. This rejection was temporary. By mid-century, critics were rediscovering his experimental side. The late poems that broke traditional forms, the novels that shattered conventional structure, the plays that mixed genres recklessly. Hugo the revolutionary returned, but now as literary revolutionary, not just political one. Structuralist critics found in his work self-conscious play with language and form. Marxist critics appreciated his class analysis. Feminist critics examined his female characters, finding both progressive and problematic elements. Post-colonial critics studied his writings on empire and race, seeing a figure struggling toward positions his culture hadn't yet developed vocabulary for. Everyone found something to argue about, which meant he remained vital. The bicentennial of his birth in 2002 brought massive celebrations across France. New editions, television specials, academic conferences, public readings. President Chirac gave a speech at the Pantheon calling Hugo France's conscience. The Socialist Party claimed him. So did centrists. Even some conservatives found aspects to praise. He'd become universal enough that everyone could claim a piece. But his truest legacy isn't in France or literature. It's in the idea he spent his life promoting, that individuals matter, that society has obligations to its weakest members, that poverty is a crime committed by the powerful against the powerless, that justice delayed is justice denied, that words and stories can change how people see the world and therefore change the world itself. Every time someone reads Les Misérables and feels anger at injustice, Hugo wins. Every time a writer believes their work can matter beyond entertainment, that's Hugo's legacy. Every time someone argues that art has moral responsibilities, they're fighting a battle he fought. The question haunts every idealist who picks up a pen. Can stories actually change anything? Or are they just beautiful distractions while the real machinery of power grinds on? Hugo believed with religious fervour that they could, but belief and reality don't always align. So what actually happened? When Les Misérables landed in bookstores, when thousands of readers finished that final page, did anything shift? The evidence is strange and scattered. Not one big moment, but hundreds of small ones accumulating across decades. A factory owner in Lyon read the sections on Fantine's exploitation and reformed his hiring practices. He wrote Hugo a letter about it. We have the letter. A priest in Marseille started a program helping ex-convicts find work after reading about Jean Valjean's struggles. Parish records document this. A politician named René Waldeck-Rousseau, who'd later become Prime Minister, cited Hugo's attack on the death penalty when arguing for its abolition in Parliament. The transcript exists. These aren't myths. They're documented cases of one person reading words and choosing differently afterward. But measuring cultural influence isn't like measuring chemistry. You can't isolate variables. France was already moving towards social reform in the 1860s. Industrialization was creating new labor movements. Scientific socialism was gaining intellectual credibility. Would all that have happened without Hugo? Probably. Would it have happened the same way? That's the real question. What Hugo did was give abstract ideas emotional weight. Poverty wasn't a statistic anymore. It was Fantine selling her hair, her teeth, her body to feed a child she'd never see again. Injustice wasn't a concept for debate. It was Valjean hunted for decades because he stole bread when starving. Redemption wasn't theology. It was a man choosing goodness despite every reason to choose cruelty. He made people feel things they'd only thought about before. That's different. That's dangerous. The novel became a weapon in political fights Hugo never anticipated. Socialists quoted it to argue for revolution. Reformers quoted it to argue against revolution. Anarchists loved the barricade scenes. Liberals loved the redemption arc. Everyone found ammunition, which meant everyone had to engage with the underlying questions. Should society exist to serve individuals, or individuals to serve society? Do circumstances excuse crime? Does punishment reform anyone, or just satisfy revenge? Can people fundamentally change? These weren't new questions, but Hugo forced millions to confront them emotionally rather than abstractly. You can ignore a philosophical treatise, harder to ignore Fantine dying alone. The Catholic Church had complicated feelings. On one hand, Hugo's anti-clericalism was undeniable. Bishop Muriel was saintly, but the Church as institution got savaged throughout. On the other hand, the book was deeply Christian in its ethics. Forgiveness, sacrifice, love, overcoming hate. These were gospel values, whatever Hugo's personal beliefs. Some bishops condemned it, others quietly recommended it. Priests found themselves in the odd position of agreeing with Hugo's values, while disagreeing with his conclusions about their institution. That tension was productive. It forced internal church debates about social responsibility that might not have happened otherwise. The book's influence spread weirdest in places Hugo never visited. Russian revolutionaries read it in translation and saw their own oppression mirrored. Japanese reformers during the Meiji period used it to argue for Western-style legal systems. Indian independence activists found parallels to colonial exploitation. The story was specific to 19th century France, but the patterns were universal enough that people everywhere recognized themselves. This is what happens when you write about fundamentals. Hunger, injustice, love, sacrifice. These aren't culturally specific. The details change, but the core experiences translate. Hugo tapped into something beneath nationality or era. the human response to being crushed by systems too big to fight, and the stubborn insistence that fighting anyway matters. But did the book actually reduce poverty, end capital punishment, reform prisons? The honest answer is no, not directly. France still had slums in 1900, worse than anything in the novel. The death penalty wasn't abolished until 1981. Prisons remained brutal. What changed was consciousness. The number of people who looked at poverty and saw a moral emergency rather than natural order, who looked at criminals and saw failed systems rather than failed souls, who believed society could be different because someone had imagined it different convincingly enough. That's not nothing. Revolutions start in imagination before they start in streets. The musical that premiered in 1980 created a second wave of influence, completely different from the first. Cameron Mackintosh's production turned Hugo's political epic into emotional spectacle. The barricade became backdrop for love stories. The social analysis got compressed into "Do you hear the people sing?" Revolutionary theory became 3 minutes of soaring melody. Literary purists hated this. They saw dumbing down, commercialization, the reduction of complex ideas to sentiment. They weren't entirely wrong. The musical simplifies ruthlessly. Whole characters disappear. The philosophical digressions that make up half the novel vanish completely. What remains is skeleton plot and big emotions. But something unexpected happened. The musical reached people who'd never read the book and never would. Teenagers who couldn't get through Hugo's prose sat in theatres weeping at Fantine's death. Audiences who found 19th century literature impenetrable connected immediately with the same story set to music. The emotional core that Hugo spent 1,200 pages building. The musical delivered in 3 hours. This created strange cultural moments. During the 2014 Hong Kong protests, demonstrators sang "Do you hear the people sing?" in Cantonese. During the 2013 Turkish protests, crowds sang it in Turkish. During various Occupy movements, it became unofficial anthem. These protesters weren't thinking about July Revolution or June Rebellion. Most probably hadn't read Hugo, but they'd absorbed through the musical the idea that rebellion against injustice is noble. That standing together against overwhelming power matters even if you lose. That some things are worth barricading streets for. Hugo would have been baffled by the music and delighted by the impact. He wanted his work to inspire action. The form was secondary. The novel's influence on other writers is easier to trace. Dostoevsky read Les Misérables while writing Crime and Punishment. The parallels are obvious. Both feature criminals seeking redemption. Both explore whether society or individual bears responsibility for crime. Both use Christian symbolism while questioning Christian institutions. Raskolnikov is Jean Valjean if the redemption arc failed. Tolstoy studied Hugo's technique of mixing historical analysis with personal story. War and Peace does exactly what Les Misérables does, uses individual characters to illuminate vast social forces. The philosophical digressions Tolstoy inserted into his novel about history and free will mirror Hugo's digressions about slang and sewers and revolution. Dickens and Hugo influenced each other across the Channel. Both were preoccupied with urban poverty and social reform. Both mixed melodrama with social criticism. Both believed novels could be moral instruction without being boring. The main difference was temperament. Dickens was fundamentally hopeful about institutions. Reform the system and people flourish. Hugo was anarchist at heart. Systems themselves were suspect. Only individuals choosing goodness could save anything. 20th century writers had more ambivalent relationships with Hugo. His sentimentality embarrassed modernists who valued irony and emotional restraint. His faith in progress seemed naive after 2 world wars. His lengthy digressions violated every principle of tight economical prose. Yet his influence persisted in unexpected places. Toni Morrison's Beloved does what Les Misérables does, takes historical trauma and makes it intimate. The Haunting of 124 operates like Hugo's sewers, a physical manifestation of buried history forcing its way up. Morrison's refusal to simplify or resolve echoes Hugo's refusal to offer easy answers about revolution and violence. Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children uses Hugo's technique of individual lives embodying national history. Salim Sinai, born at the exact moment of Indian independence, functions like Hugo's characters, embodying specific aspects of French society. The personal and political completely intertwined. Even writers who rejected Hugo's style absorbed his ambition. The idea that a novel could be comprehensive, could include everything: history, philosophy, social criticism, romance, adventure, comedy, tragedy. That fiction's job was to capture the totality of human experience, not just one refined slice. Maximalism as aesthetic choice traces directly to Hugo, the confidence that more is more. That digression enriches rather than distracts. That readers can handle complexity and density if the underlying story compels them forward. Every 700-page contemporary novel owes something to Les Misérables, proving readers would stick with such a thing. But influence isn't always positive. Hugo's sentimentality enabled bad writing for generations. His tendency toward melodrama gave ammunition to critics who dismissed socially conscious literature as propaganda. His faith that virtue would triumph if fully depicted led to naive art that collapsed on contact with reality. The question isn't whether Hugo influenced culture. Obviously, he did. The question is whether that influence made things better, whether the world is improved by having Les Misérables in it. Impossible to prove definitively, but consider this. Every person who read the novel and felt their hearts break for Fantine, every reader who finished and thought maybe people deserve second chances, every teenager who encountered Jean Valjean and realized goodness requires choosing it repeatedly, not just once. Every activist who found courage in the barricade scenes, even knowing those students lost. Those are real effects, in real minds. They accumulate. Culture shifts not through single catalytic moments, but through thousands of individual changes in perception and priority. Hugo gave people a story to carry, a framework for understanding their own experiences of injustice, a vocabulary for talking about poverty as moral failure of society rather than moral failure of poor people, a narrative proving that redemption is possible, that systems can be resisted, that individuals matter even when crushed by history. These ideas existed before Hugo, but he gave them form that could lodge in memory and shape behaviour. That's not small. That's what art does when it works. It doesn't change the world directly. It changes people who then change the world incrementally. The French Third Republic, established after Napoleon III's fall, embraced Hugo's vision of secular democratic republicanism. The separation of church and state he'd advocated became law. Universal education he'd demanded became reality. The social safety nets he imagined began materializing, not because politicians read Les Misérables and reformed, though some did, but because the culture had shifted enough that these ideas seemed obvious rather than radical. Hugo helped create the conditions for that shift. He wasn't alone. Zola contributed, so did dozens of other writers and activists and politicians whose names are forgotten. Social change is collective, but Hugo's voice was loudest and reached furthest. By the time of his death, the changes he'd advocated his entire life were becoming normal. Not completed, not perfected, but directionally correct. France was stumbling toward becoming the country he'd imagined in his fiction and demanded in his speeches. He didn't live to see most of it. The Third Republic was only 5 years old when he died. The social reforms were just beginning. The full flowering of French republicanism would take decades more. But he saw enough to know the direction was right. In his final years, he received visitors at his house on Avenue des Lau, politicians seeking advice, writers seeking blessing, ordinary people seeking to meet the man whose books had meant something to them. He received them all with the same courtly dignity, still vain, still convinced of his own importance, but also genuinely interested in their stories. One visitor asked what he wanted his legacy to be. Hugo supposedly said he wanted to be remembered as someone who'd fought for the oppressed, not as a writer, as a fighter. The writing was just the weapon. That's probably apocryphal, but it captures something true about how he saw himself. Artist second, activist first. The novels were beautiful because they had to be beautiful to work, but their purpose was never beauty. Their purpose was change. The funeral was theatre on a scale Paris had never seen, not for a king, for a writer. May 22nd, 1885. Victor Hugo had died at 83 after a brief illness. The government immediately declared a national day of mourning and began planning something unprecedented. They would give him a state funeral, the highest honour France could bestow, but Hugo had left instructions in his will. He wanted a pauper's funeral, a simple coffin, no ceremony, buried in the cemetery for the poor. It was his final gesture of solidarity with the miserable ones he'd spent his life defending. The government had a problem. They couldn't ignore his wishes entirely, but they also couldn't let the greatest writer in French history be buried like a pauper. The compromise was typically French, elaborate and simple. I see. They would honour the spirit of his request, while creating spectacle anyway. His body lay in state beneath the Arc de Triomphe, draped in black crepe. But the coffin was indeed a pauper's coffin. Simple wood, exactly as he'd requested. The juxtaposition was deliberate. The humble coffin under the monument to military glory. The writer who'd spent decades attacking war, honoured at the shrine to French martial pride. It worked because it was contradictory. 2 million people filed past to pay respects, half the population of Paris. The line stretched for miles. Workers stood alongside aristocrats. The poor he'd written about mourning alongside the literary establishment he'd dominated. Children were lifted up to see. Women wept openly. Men removed their hats and stood in silence. For 3 days, Paris was a city of mourners. The funeral procession itself was 12 hours long. Every literary society, every political club, every workers' organisation sent delegations. School children marched in formation. Veterans of 1848 walked alongside veterans of the Commune. Old revolutionaries whose causes had failed, but who recognised Hugo as one of their own. Foreign delegations came from across Europe and beyond. Italy sent representatives. So did Spain, Belgium, England. Latin American countries whose independence movements Hugo had supported sent wreaths and tributes. It wasn't just France mourning, it was everyone who'd read his books and felt less alone. The procession moved through Paris at walking pace. Crowds lined every street. Buildings were draped in black. Businesses close. It was less like a funeral than a coronation in reverse, a nation acknowledging that this man had mattered more than most politicians, more than most generals, more than almost anyone. They buried him in the Pantheon, the great domed building in the Latin Quarter, where France entombs its immortals. Originally a church, it had been secularized during the Revolution, turned back into a church, secularized again. Hugo's burial there was deeply symbolic. He'd fought his entire life for secular republicanism. Now he rested in what had been a church, but was now a temple to human rather than divine greatness. His tomb sits alongside Voltaire and Rousseau, the Enlightenment philosophers whose intellectual grandchildren he'd been. Later they'd add Zola and Dumas and others, but in 1885, Hugo joined, the Trinity of French secular saints. The inscription on his tomb is simple: Victor Hugo. No titles, no dates, no description. Just the name. Everyone knew who he was. What does it mean that 2 million people attended a writer's funeral, that governments negotiate how to honor someone who made things up for a living? Literature doesn't usually command that kind of public devotion. Politicians get state funerals. Military heroes get parades. But writers? We put them in the culture section and move on. Hugo's funeral suggests something different, that stories matter, that the person who gives a nation its mythology, who articulates its values, who creates the language through which people understand themselves, that person is as important as anyone who ever held power. Maybe more importante. NT, because power is temporary, but stories last. The Third Republic used Hugo's funeral to legitimize itself. Look, they were saying, this is who we honor. Not emperors, not generals. A man who wrote books and fought for justice. That's what this republic values. It was propaganda, but effective propaganda because it was also true. They really did value what Hugo represented. The secular education reforms were already underway. The social safety net was expanding. The political principles he'd advocated were becoming law. His funeral was both tribute and mission statement. This is what we're building. A country where the writer matters as much as the warrior, where ideas compete with armies, where justice is the goal, not glory. They didn't achieve it. The Third Republic would face scandal, instability, colonial atrocities, and eventually collapse under German invasion. But the aspiration mattered. Hugo's funeral announced what France wanted to be, even if it kept failing to get there. The international response revealed something else. Hugo's influence had escaped France entirely. Translations of Les Misérables existed in dozens of languages. People in Russia, America, China, Japan had read his novels. They didn't all care about French politics or the Commune or Napoleon III. But they cared about Jean Valjean. They cared about Quasimodo. They recognized something universal in Hugo's particular French stories. The funeral made global news. Papers in New York, London, Buenos Aires, Melbourne ran front-page coverage. Not because Hugo had done anything in those countries. Bexy, his books had reached readers there and changed how they thought. Literature's power is strange. A politician's influence ends when they leave office. A general's victories fade into history. But a novel keeps working. It sits on shelves, gets assigned in schools, finds new readers every generation who encounter the same story their grandparents read and discover it still lands. Hugo understood this. He'd written in his preface to Les Misérables that as long as poverty and ignorance exist, books like his would be necessary. Not because they'd solve those problems, because they'd keep the problems visible, keep people caring, keep the pressure on systems to reform. He was right. Les Misérables is still necessary. We still have poverty. We still have people crushed by systems TIs don't care. We still need stories reminding us that those people matter, that systems can change, that individuals have dignity regardless of what society says. The novel hasn't fixed anything, but it's kept the conversation alive for 160 years. That's not nothing. The funeral also revealed Hugo's complicated relationship with his own ego. He'd requested a pauper's coffin, genuine humility mixed with awareness that the gesture would be noticed and admired. He'd spent his life cultivating his image as champion of the oppressed while also enjoying wealth, fame, and the company of powerful people. The contradictions never resolved. He was simultaneously sincere and theatrical, genuinely committed and deeply vain. But maybe that's necessary. Maybe changing culture requires that kind of ego. Someone has to believe their voice matters enough to keep speaking for decades. Someone has to think their stories are important enough to demand the world's attention. Humility doesn't write Les Misérables. Humility doesn't sustain a 50-year political career while also producing novels and plays and poetry. Humility doesn't stand up to emperors. Hugo's ego was the engine of his effectiveness. It let him believe he could change things when most people would have given up. It sustained him through exile, through political defeats, through personal tragedies. It made him insufferable sometimes, but it also made him consequential. After the funeral, after the crowds dispersed and Paris returned to normal, the question remained: what had Hugo actually accomplished? He hadn't overthrown any governments himself. He hadn't passed any laws. He hadn't led any armies or founded any institutions beyond his own literary career. What he'd done was harder to measure. He'd changed how people thought. Not everyone, not completely, but enough people, enough of the way that France after Hugo was different from France before him. The novel as social weapon. That was his innovation. Others had written political fiction before, but nobody had combined the scope, the emotional power, the careful research, the massive readership that Hugo achieved. He proved you could reach millions of people with complex ideas about justice and society by wrapping those ideas in story. The novel became a tool for activism. Zola learned from him. So did Dickens, though they were contemporaries, influencing each other. So did Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and countless others who realized fiction could do more than entertain. It could agitate, it could expose, it could make people care about things they'd ignored. Hugo's funeral marked the end of an era. The Romantic movement he'd championed was already fading. Realism and naturalism were taking over. Younger writers considered his style overwrought, his plots melodramatic, his moral certainty outdated. The 20th century would bring modernism, skepticism about grand narratives, suspicion of heroes and villains. Hugo's earnest belief that literature should teach and inspire would seem naive. But the work survived the style. Les Misérables remains the template for socially conscious fiction. Every novel about poverty, every story about redemption, every narrative that insists the oppressed matter and system should change, that's Hugo's inheritance. The style evolved, but the purpose endured. Political fiction, activist literature, engaged art, whatever you call it, Hugo demonstrated it could work, could reach people, could matter. Not by preaching, by storytelling, by making readers care about characters, then revealing those characters' struggles reflect real social problems. It's a trick, but an honest trick. The emotions are real even if the people aren't. The funeral's scale testified to something else: gratitude. People were grateful to Hugo, grateful he'd written their experiences, grateful he'd fought their fights, grateful he'd given them language for their anger and hope for their struggles, grateful he'd insisted hey mattered when society said otherwise. 2 million people don't attend a funeral out of obligation. They come because they feel they owe something. Hugo had given them stories that helped them survive. That's worth mourning. The decades after his death would vindicate much of what he'd fought for. Universal suffrage expanded. Education became free and secular. Social welfare systems developed. Labour rights strengthened. None of this happened because of Hugo alone, but his voice had been part of the chorus demanding change, and his stories had shaped how people understood what justice required. France became more democratic, more secular, more egalitarian, slowly, incompletely, with countless setbacks, but directionally consistent with Hugo's vision. The Third Republic wasn't the ideal society he'd imagined, but it was closer than the empires and monarchies he'd spent his life opposing. By the mid-20th century, Les Misérables had become a classic, required reading in schools, adapted into films, plays, eventually a musical that would become one of the most successful theatrical productions in history. Millions more people encountered Hugo's story through Andrew Lloyd Webber than ever read the novel. The musical simplified, sentimentalized, cut entire plot lines, but it kept the core. Redemption is possible. The poor deserve dignity. systems that crush people should be resisted. Those ideas in Hugo's voice filtered through multiple adaptations, reached global audiences who'd never heard of the Paris Commune or the July Monarchy. The story had transcended its origins. Hugo would have hated the cuts and loved the attention. His ego would have been satisfied that his work remained relevant. His activist heart would have appreciated that new generations were encountering his arguments for justice. The contradictions would have persisted, but so would the impact. What survives a writer? The books, obviously, but also the changed landscape they created. Hugo didn't just leave novels behind. He left a tradition, a model for how literature can engage with injustice, a demonstration that commercial success and artistic ambition and political commitment aren't mutually exclusive. You can write blockbusters that also matter. You can entertain while also challenging. You can reach mass audiences without condescending. That's the inheritance. Not just Les Misérables, though. That alone would be enough. But the entire career. The proof that a writer can be consequential, can shape culture, can fight power with words and sometimes win. The funeral 2 million people attended wasn't mourning just a man. It was acknowledging that stories have power, that the person who tells them right can change the world as surely as any politician or general. Maybe more slowly, maybe less visibly, but permanently. Hugo's Paris is gone. The Third Republic collapsed. The political battles he fought are finished, but Jean Valjean is still carrying Cosette through the sewers. Javert is still falling from the bridge. Fantine is still dying alone. The barricade is still falling. Those images persist because Hugo made them unforgettable. That's what lasts. That's what lasts. But what exactly does it mean for something to last? When we say Hugo's work endures, we're making a claim about cultural memory that deserves examination, because survival isn't neutral. What we remember reveals what we value, and what we forget exposes what we've moved beyond. Consider which parts of Hugo's massive output actually survived. Les Misérables, obviously, The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, though more people know the Disney version than the novel, a handful of poems, some famous quotes. But the rest, the plays that packed theatres in his lifetime, are unperformed. The political essays that caused international scandals are unread. 93, his final novel about the French Revolution, is studied by scholars and ignored by everyone else. Bug Jargal, his early abolitionist novel, is barely remembered despite addressing slavery decades before it became fashionable. This isn't failure, it's how cultural memory works. Each generation decides what it needs from the past. Hugo's 19th century readers needed his entire output, the political commentary and social analysis and historical fiction. They were living through the questions he addressed. We're not. We keep what still speaks to us and let the rest fade. That's not disrespect, it's selection. What we've kept reveals something interesting. We remember Hugo's stories about individuals crushed by systems. Jean Valjean and Quasimodo are immortal because they represent something we still recognize. The person destroyed by social machinery they didn't create and can't control. That resonates across centuries because the basic dynamic hasn't changed. The specific systems are different, but the experience of being ground up by forces larger than yourself remains universal. We've largely forgotten his explicitly political work, the speeches about constitutional monarchy versus republicanism, the essays about specific legislative battles, the poems celebrating or denouncing particular revolutions. This isn't because those things were unimportant. They were crucial in their moment. But the moment passed, the Third Republic came and went. The questions Hugo debated with such passion were answered, and we've moved on to different questions. His fiction survived because it addressed something beneath the political surface: the hunger for dignity, the possibility of redemption, the cost of poverty. Those don't expire. There's irony here. Hugo desperately wanted to be remembered as a political figure, a statesman who happened to write, someone who changed France through direct action as much as through literature. He succeeded in that during his lifetime. The exile made him a symbol, the return made him a hero, the funeral made him a monument. But what actually endured was the work he sometimes treated as secondary to his political mission. The novels outlasted the speeches, the characters outlasted the causes. Literature trumped politics after all. This would have frustrated him, and he would have been wrong to be frustrated, because his literature was political, just not in the way he thought. Les Misérables didn't change specific laws, but it changed how readers thought about poverty, crime, punishment, redemption. That's deeper than legislation. Laws can be repealed, shifted perspectives persist. The novel trained generations of readers to see the poor as Jean Valjean rather than as statistics or threats. That's political work, just slow, just invisible, just permanent. Modern readers encounter Hugo differently than his contemporaries did. We're not waiting years for the next installment. We're not reading him alongside newspaper accounts of political upheaval. We're not debating whether his ideas about prison reform or education are dangerous or necessary. We're just reading stories, good ones. Stories that work on their own terms, even when we don't share Hugo's ideology or care about his historical context. That's the test of lasting literature. Can it survive the death of its immediate relevance? Can it mean something to people who don't know or care about the circumstances that produced it? Hugo passes. You don't need to understand the July monarchy to care about Jean Valjean. You don't need to know anything about 19th century debates on architecture to feel for Quasimodo. The stories work because they're about human experiences that transcend their specific historical packaging. But something gets lost in that translation across time. We read Les Misérables as a redemption story. Hugo wrote it as a social manifesto with a redemption story as the vehicle. We focus on Jean Valjean's personal journey. Hugo wanted us focused on why someone would steal bread in the first place. We cry at the emotional moments. He wanted us angry at the systems creating those moments. The novel works both ways, but we've chosen which reading to prioritize, and it's not the one Hugo intended. Is that betrayal, or is it the inevitable fate of any work that survives its creator? Artists don't control their legacy. They create and release. Then the audience takes over. Hugo can't object to how we read him now. He's been dead for over a century. The work belongs to us. We use it how we need to use it. If that means reading Les Misérables as melodrama instead of manifesto, so be it. The words remain available for both interpretations. Future generations might flip back to the political reading if their circumstances make that relevant again. What's remarkable is how well Hugo anticipated this. Not consciously, perhaps, but in practice, he wrote books designed to reach the widest possible audience. He built in multiple entry points. You could read Les Misérables as adventure or romance or social critique or theological meditation or historical document. He gave you everything, trusting that different readers would find different doors in. That catholicity of approach is why the work survived. It's flexible enough to mean different things in different eras. Compare him to writers who were more artistically pure. Flaubert, his contemporary, crafted perfect prose and sneered at the public. Flaubert is still read, but only by people who care about literary craft. Hugo is read by everyone. The difference isn't talent, it's approach. Flaubert wrote for posterity. Hugo wrote for next week's sales numbers. Paradoxically, the populist impulse produced the more durable legacy. People don't preserve what they admire from a distance. They preserve what they love. Hugo made himself lovable. His influence extends beyond the obvious descendants. Yes, there's a direct line to writers like Steinbeck and Dickens, who combined social consciousness with popular appeal. But Hugo's fingerprints are all over modern culture in less visible ways. Every story about an outcast finding redemption owes something to Jean Valjean. Every narrative about systems crushing individuals echoes Les Misérables. Every moment when popular entertainment tries to say something serious about injustice is walking a path Hugo cleared. The musical is the clearest example of this ongoing influence. When it premiered in 1985, critics hated it. Too sentimental, too melodramatic, too much. The public disagreed. The show became a global phenomenon, running for decades, seen by millions. It's now among the longest-running and highest-grossing productions in theatre history. Why? Because it delivered what Hugo delivered. Big emotions, clear morality, spectacle combined with substance. The suggestion that ordinary suffering matters. That's the Hugo formula, and it still works. There's something almost vindictive about this. Hugo was dismissed by serious critics in his lifetime as too commercial, too crowd-pleasing, too emotional. The same criticisms were levelled at the musical adaptation. Both succeeded anyway. Both proved that popular and meaningful aren't opposites. Both demonstrated that you can give audiences what they want while also giving them what they need. The critics were wrong in 1862 and wrong in 1985 for the same reasons. What doesn't survive is often as revealing as what does. Hugo's worst impulses have been quietly forgotten. The racial stereotypes in Bug Jargal, the occasional lapses into Orientalism, the sometimes patronizing attitude toward the poor he claimed to defend. We don't talk about those much, not because we're whitewashing history, but because they're not what matters about Hugo. They're the period details, the contextual static, the stuff every artist from every era carries that future generations will wince at. This is how cultural memory works. We extract what's valuable and let the rest decay. Hugo understood this better than most. He knew he was writing for future readers he'd never meet. He structured his novels to survive him. The long digressions on Parisian sewers or the Battle of Waterloo weren't just showing off. They were insurance. He was building monuments designed to last. Some parts would crumble, but enough would remain to keep the whole structure standing. The ultimate question isn't whether Hugo matters now. Obviously he does. Les Misérables alone guarantees that. The question is what he'll mean a century from now. What will readers in 2125 make of him? Will they still care about Jean Valjean? Will the barricade still resonate? Or will Hugo finally fade into the category of important but unread, studied by specialists but ignored by the culture? Impossible to predict. Cultural memory is too chaotic. Books that seem immortal vanish. Forgotten writers get rediscovered. Reputations rise and fall based on factors having nothing to do with quality. Hugo survived this long. That's not a guarantee of anything, just evidence that something in the work connects across time. Whether that connection will persist another century is unknowable. What we can say is this: Hugo gave us a model for how art engages with the world, not by retreating into aestheticism, not by subordinating itself to propaganda, but by telling human stories that carry larger meanings, by making readers feel and think simultaneously, by refusing to choose between entertainment and significance. That model remains valuable as long as writers are trying to say something meaningful while also reaching actual audiences. Hugo's example matters. He wasn't a saint. His personal life was messy. His politics were sometimes confused. His novels are flawed, sprawling, uneven. He was vain, egotistical, occasionally ridiculous. The funeral with 2 million people was exactly the kind of spectacle he would have wanted, which makes it slightly embarrassing. But none of that diminishes what he accomplished. He wrote books that changed how people thought. He created characters who became permanent residents of the cultural imagination. He proved that popularity and substance can coexist. That's enough. The work remains. Les Misérables is still in print, still adapted, still read, still teaching new generations that redemption is possible and systems are changeable, and the poor deserve dignity. The Hunchback still stands as a defense of the outcast. The poems still circulate, quoted by people who don't know they're quoting Hugo. The influence is diffused now, so woven into culture that it's invisible. But it's there. That's what survives a writer. Not the fame or the funeral or the monuments, the ideas they planted, the perspectives they shifted, the stories they told well enough to become permanent. Hugo did that. Not perfectly, not without contradictions, but successfully enough that we're still talking about him nearly 150 years after his death. He wanted to be remembered as the man who changed France. He'll be remembered as the man who wrote Les Misérables. That's not the same thing, but it might be better. France has changed many times since Hugo died. The political structures he fought for and against have all collapsed and been replaced. But Jean Valjean is still stealing bread and discovering mercy. That image has outlasted empires. Stories do that sometimes. They find something true enough and tell it well enough that it becomes permanent. Hugo found it, he told it, and now it's ours to carry forward or let fade, to interpret and reinterpret, to use as each generation needs. That's the inheritance, not answers, but questions, not solutions, but challenges, not comfort, but confrontation with what we owe each other. The work asks, what does justice require? How should we treat the vulnerable? Can people change? Should systems that crush individuals be tolerated? Hugo spent his life wrestling with those questions. He never fully answered them, but he made them impossible to ignore. That's what lasts. 2 million people attended a funeral for someone who made up stories. That fact alone tells you something shifted in human culture. Not gradually, suddenly. In the span of one lifetime, the writer became a category of person who could matter as much as generals or kings. Hugo didn't invent that possibility, but he proved it could work. He demonstrated that if you wrote well enough, reached widely enough, and refused to shut up about injustice loudly enough, you could shape how millions of people understood their world, not through force, through sentences. The books remain because they're still true. We don't have the same poverty Hugo described. Our systems of oppression have updated their interfaces, but the core experience he captured, being ground up by machinery you didn't build and can't escape, that hasn't changed. Jean Valjean stealing bread because his sister's children are starving, that's still happening. Different details, same desperation, different country, same injustice. Every time someone reads Les Misérables and thinks maybe people deserve second chances, Hugo wins. Every time a writer believes their work can matter beyond entertainment, that's his legacy. Every time someone looks at poverty and sees a moral emergency rather than natural order, they're seeing through eyes Hugo helped train. He wasn't perfect. His ego was insufferable. His politics were sometimes confused. His personal life was a disaster of infidelities and contradictions. He wrote too much, digressed too often, and trusted melodrama when restraint would have worked better. The critics who called him excessive weren't wrong. They were just missing the point. The point was reach. Hugo wanted everyone. He wanted the workers and the aristocrats, the educated and the illiterate, the people who'd never touched a book, and the scholars who'd read everything. He built his novels with multiple entry points because he understood that cultural change requires mass participation. You can't shift consciousness by writing for a small elite. You shift it by writing something so compelling that people who don't normally read novels buy this one anyway. Les Misérables sold out its first printing in hours. Not because Hugo was famous, though he was, because people desperately wanted what he was offering. A story that took their suffering seriously. Characters who looked like them instead of the usual aristocratic protagonists. A narrative insisting they mattered despite what every power structure told them. That's radical. It's easy to miss now because we're used to art claiming ordinary people matter. But in 1862, that wasn't obvious. The poor were background, decoration, comic relief or moral lessons. They weren't protagonists, they weren't complex. They weren't fully human in the way fictional aristocrats were human. Hugo said no. Fantine is the protagonist of her section. Jean Valjean, the convict, is the hero of the entire novel. The workers on the barricade get their own chapters, their own dignity, their own tragic nobility. This was revolutionary in a way that's hard to see from here, because Hugo won. We expect novels to do this now, because he did it first successfully enough that it became the template. The musical reaching 130 million people proves the story still works. You can strip away the historical context, the political theory, the philosophical digressions, and what remains still lands. Because underneath everything else, it's about whether people can change, whether society should help them, whether mercy matters more than revenge. Those questions don't expire. France became more of what Hugo wanted, slowly, with constant backsliding, through decades of struggle by people who'd never read his books, but were fighting the same fights. He didn't cause the change alone, but his voice was part of the chorus. His stories gave people language for what they already felt. His characters became symbols they could rally around. That's what literature does when it works. It doesn't create movements, it clarifies them. It gives form to inchoate anger and vague hopes. It shows people they're not alone in what they're feeling. It proves someone else saw what they're seeing and thought it mattered enough to spend years writing it down. Hugo spent his whole life doing that. Every novel, every poem, every speech in exile, he kept insisting that the wretched ones mattered, that systems could change, that individuals choosing goodness could shift the world even when everything seemed hopeless. He never stopped saying it, even when nobody wanted to hear it, even when it cost him everything. The exile proved him right. Napoleon III fell. Hugo returned. The Republic was restored. He outlived his enemies and watched his ideas become mainstream. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to know the direction was correct. What remains is harder to measure. Not laws or governments, those change constantly, but the shifted consciousness, the expanded sense of who deserves dignity, the expectation that art should engage with injustice rather than ignore it. The proof that commercial success and moral seriousness aren't opposites. The model of the writer as public intellectual who matters. Every socially conscious novel written since owes him something. Every writer trying to reach mass audiences while saying something meaningful is walking a path he cleared. Every story about redemption or resistance, or the poor deserving better, is built on foundations he laid. He changed what was possible. Before Hugo, novels were entertainment or instruction. After Hugo, they could be both. Ambitious and accessible, popular and profound, thrilling and thoughtful. You could give readers adventure and romance and also make them question every assumption their society had taught them about who matters and why. That's the inheritance, not the specific politics which are dated, not the style which is too much for modern taste, but the ambition, the refusal to choose between reaching people and challenging them, the insistence that literature should matter beyond the page. Jean Valjean is still carrying Cosette through the sewers. Javert is still falling from the bridge. The barricade is still rising and falling. These images persist because Hugo made them unforgettable, because he found something true about human experience and told it well enough that it became permanent. That's what survives, not the man with his vanity and contradictions, not the political figure whose specific battles are finished, but the stories, the characters, the questions he forced people to ask. Those outlasted empires. They'll probably outlast us too. Stories do that sometimes. When they're true enough and told well enough, they escape their moment. They become property of everyone who needs them. Each generation reads them differently, finds different meanings, uses them for different purposes. That's not failure. That's success. The work flexible enough to serve changing needs is the work that lasts. Hugo gave us that. A massive, flawed, brilliant body of work that keeps generating meaning long after its creator died. books that still ask uncomfortable questions, characters who still feel alive, a model for how art engages with the world that remains relevant even when the specific world it engaged with is gone. He wanted to change France. He changed how we think about what literature can do. That's bigger than France. That's permanent. The funeral with 2 million people wasn't mourning a man. It was acknowledging that stories have power, that the person who tells them right can shift human consciousness as surely as any revolution. Maybe more surely, because revolutions fail and stories endure. Hugo's Paris is gone. The systems he fought are replaced. The political battles he waged are settled. But the questions remain. What is justice? What do we owe each other? Can people change? Should the vulnerable be protected or blamed? These don't have final answers. They have to be asked and answered again by every generation. Hugo asked them loudly enough that we're still hearing the echo. That's what lasts, not fame or monuments or state funerals. The questions planted deep enough that they keep sprouting. The stories told well enough that they become permanent residents of human imagination. The insistence that ordinary suffering matters and that those who witness it have an obligation to say so. He said so for 80 years. We're still listening. That's legacy enough for anyone.